certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
WA gripped by fear.
All members of Western Australia have got a responsibility because these are our daughters and sisters.
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Welcome to day 3 of Claremont, the Trial in Conversation, a day when accused serial killer Bradley Edwards' first wife was called as a witness, and the most intimate and salacious details of their marriage revealed. I'm Natalie Bonjolo. Also joining us from inside District Court tonight, we have The West's Legal Affairs Editor, Tim Clarke. Hi, Tim.
Hi, guys. And
welcome also to reporter Emily Moulton. And Emily, you're live blogging from inside the court every day. How does that actually work?
Well, it involves a lot of blood, sweat and tears on my part. Basically, the way it's been set up in the District Court is there's 2 media rooms and there's one that's specifically set up for journalists who are working. And so the trial is actually live streamed into this room and I'm just set up with my laptop and basically listening to everything as it happens and typing as it happens as quickly as I can. And basically we see pretty much the entire courtroom, but we don't get to see some of the exhibits or videos and things like that just because of the technology with the courts at the moment. But basically when it's said, I'm sitting there just typing it out as quick as I can.
And having a look at it today, that's just what's so amazing about this blog is the detail that you're able to include. I mean, I feel like we're seeing or hearing everything.
Oh, I hope so. I'm trying to get as much as I can out as quick as I can. But yeah, I guess that's the one great thing about digital technology is that anyone can feel like they're there when they're not there just because it's basically instant information. So that's what we're trying to do with the blog and trying to, I guess, bring the courtroom to people who can't actually physically be there.
The world really has changed, hasn't it? And well, let's talk about some of those details that did come out in court today. And I think, obviously we had the first wife who was a witness. What sort of questions were being asked of her today, Tim?
Well, as you said, Nat, sort of quite intimate questions, but they were quite they were directed to a certain strategy of the prosecution. I mean, they weren't just questions for no reason, and if they had been, the judge and probably the defence lawyer would have stood up and said something about it. But she was basically taken through her relationship with Mr. Edwards from start to finish. And from when they met to when and where they got married, the status of a relationship all the way through, and then the disintegration of the relationship and what happened after that. And the reason for that, ostensibly or most pointedly from the prosecution, is what we've discussed before about the motive, the theory of the motive from the prosecution, which is that the emotional triggers or the emotional turmoil in Mr. Edwards' personal life was then driving him on to basically take out his frustrations on lone women. And so the details of that, the dates of that, the lead up to those things was what Miss Barbara Galler, the prosecutor, was trying to get out of the witness, and also some other details about cars that he'd driven and his appearance at certain times during their marriage, whether he had a beard or not, and things like that. So, I mean, that was the reason for it. And whether it worked as well as Miss Barbara Gallo had anticipated or hoped, well, I mean, that's for observers, and most specifically the judge to decide way down the track.
And obviously, with some of these questions, they are so private. How did she appear with the questions, the witness?
She was pretty calm, pretty clipped in her answers. I mean, she wasn't a witness that you sometimes get that like to talk. She was very specifically answering the question, which is what judges like. It's not what reporters like, because we want all the colour and the juice and the movement of sometimes what comes with sort of personal witnesses. She's given, we think, as many as 4 or 5 statements, official statements to police. So she'd be very used to answering questions about her first marriage now after the 3 years. And so I think that came through a little bit today in her evidence, the way she answered the questions.
She wasn't in the courtroom, of course, was she?
Correct. Yeah. No. I mean, as Em said before, she was being sort of talked to and cross-examined and questioned from a remote room in the court. There's various reasons they do that. You might not want to be in the same room as the accused. But obviously, this case being this case and this trial being this trial, it's a very intimidating atmosphere. There's lots of people, lots of eyes on you. And so the judge can agree to do that, basically to preserve the sanctity of the evidence. I mean, he doesn't want people not clamming up or getting too upset or whatever. Right. So to make sure, as we've discussed before, that the whole process runs smoothly, she was obviously allowed to do that. But we could see her on the screen as she was giving that evidence, so you do get the body language as well as the verbal language.
And I'm just curious with Bradley Edwards, is he watching that screen as well? We know he's got that screen in his eye line. Is he watching, is he reacting to anything that she's saying during this examination?
Not much that I could see, I've got to say. I'd love to be able to say that he was wincing and grimacing, but he simply wasn't. I mean, he was listening intently, as he has done all the way through so far. But there was no real sort of physical or visceral reaction that I could see.
He almost seems emotionless through the trial, from what I've seen so far. He doesn't, there's been very little reaction from him at all throughout this whole process.
She was questioned about their early relationship and an argument that they had. Was this prior to when they got married?
Yes, it was. So, this is quite a key moment, because this argument is then said to have led to the emotional upset, which then led to Mr. Edwards attacking the woman in Hollywood Hospital, and this was just before they were married, and the argument was actually about whether they were going to get married.
Right.
So, I mean, she was taken through that, that the argument itself. So she wasn't then taken through what had happened the day after. She did raise it herself, but she wasn't questioned particularly hard about that, which again was a little bit of a surprise to me.
So what was the Hollywood Hospital incident, Tim?
So in 1990, Mr. Edwards was just about 21, just older, and he had already had his job as a Telstra technician, and he was working there in what they call the PABX system, which is the internal switchboard, for want of a better word. He was working to either fix that or upgrade that or something, and as we said, the night before that, he'd had the argument with his first wife, who was become his first wife, his partner at the time, about the status of the relationship, whether marriage was on the cards. They'd had a row, and he'd gone to work the next day quite upset about it. He also had a bit of a mare at work, couldn't get what he was doing fixed, and then a lady who was working in the hospital as a social worker, he asked her where the toilet was. She had not abruptly, but, hadn't really engaged in conversation with him. And according to what the court was told later on, this sort of tipped him over the edge, and he basically attacked her from behind, grabbed her, tried to restrain her, dragged her back on her chair, and was dragging her towards a toilet in the area of the hospital. She managed to fight back, and then ran to a ward next door, got the security guard, who then basically made a sort of citizen's arrest, or detained Mr. Edwards until the police arrived.
And when did his girlfriend find out that her boyfriend had done this?
We assume after, but that wasn't actually explored today.
Yeah, it was a little bit. I mean, she said that he usually picked her up and dropped her off at work. and that was the only time that she could remember that he had basically left her stranded, and that was that day, and we know because he was in custody at the time. That's how she's found out about that. Apparently, is that she had to get a bus home, then got home, and then, as I say, it wasn't really explored, but presumably then she found out either from him or the police later what he'd done. And as we know, he put his hand up for that right at the time. It was only a few days later that he actually appeared in court and pleaded guilty and was sentenced, and everything was wrapped up very, very quickly.
And they went on to become married after that.
Indeed, which is an interesting sort of side note, but I think one that will be explored a little bit in a bit more depth a bit later on as to certainly the relationship maintained, and almost as surprisingly, his job maintained as well. I mean, he carried that attack out while he was in a professional capacity for Telstra, was given probation, was placed on a sex offender treatment program, but still maintained his job for about another 28 years after that.
Was there any discipline at all in from his work at the time? Do you know?
We don't know. We've never been told. And sort of Telstra have never been sort of brought up in the pre-trials. I'm sure. Well, I'm sure it would have been a question that's certainly been asked since, but no, that hasn't been explored in public as yet.
And when did their marriage start to break down? And in what way? I understand he became quite obsessed with computers at some point.
Yeah, she mentioned on the stand today that when she was asked when the relationship started to break down, and her answer was when the computer arrived. Right. So then she said that when Carmel Barbagallo was asking her, what do you mean by the computer? She said, he brought home a computer, and he used to just, at home, when he'd finish get home from work, we'd have dinner, and then he'd go straight to the room where the computer was set up, and he'd just be on it all night. And then she'd say, some nights I'd go to bed on my own. And then she was asked, Ms. Barbagallo asked her a question, was there any times where you woke up and he was still on it? And she said yes, and then she was asked, did you see anything on the computer? She said no, but I could just see the light was on. And so she said that that's when it started, the relationship between the two started to deteriorate. And then I think one of her quotes was that she felt like he wasn't interested in the marriage anymore, that he wasn't present. So therefore she then, I think, sort of a few weeks, months later, she struck up this friendship with this other man. Right. And she said it was just a friendship, but then obviously it progressed to something further.
So that was the affair that was talked about today?
Yes. They brought up that as well today. So Mr. Edwards' first wife was then asked about sort of when did this friendship start, and then when did it become a sexual relationship? And obviously the man had moved into their house, so they had this, I guess, strange living arrangement where Mr. Edwards and his first wife lived together, and then the man who became her lover was also living there at the same time.
And did Bradley Edwards know that they were having an affair initially or not?
Well, it would appear that if he didn't know specifically, he certainly had his suspicions, because it was sort of detailed today how at one stage he caught this man and his wife hugging and kissing in the house where they were all living together. And so, I mean, you would imagine that would have been a signal to him that something was afoot. And as I said earlier, I mean, it's all very sort of interesting detail about the background to this man, but this all was leading, these questions were all leading to this sort of emotional turmoil timeline, and where the prosecution wants to point to where they say these three critical sort of masses of emotional upset boiled up into where Mr. Edwards is alleged to have gone out and killed the three girls, and that whole motive boils back to the Hollywood Hospital incident, where reports were done by psychologists for the sentencing magistrate, And in those, Mr. Edwards actually told the psychologist, yes, it was because I was upset because of the pressure from the marriage and the pressure from my then girlfriend as to marriage. And so that's where this whole theory stems from.
So I guess following this timeline, they separate in, 1995?
Yeah, towards the end of 95.
Mm-hmm.
And then I understand there was significance in this invitation. So he's invited his ex-wife at this point to fireworks somewhere.
Yes, so the first wife had actually moved out of the house to sort of take stock and so have a think of where her two relationships were going and which way she wanted to go, and she'd moved down to her parents' place south of Perth, and she was living there at the time. And Mr. Edwards is said to have gone down there on Australia Day, or that's what the prosecution. So that's when the prosecution says he went, rocked up unannounced, asked, stayed for dinner, asked his ex-wife, estranged wife then, whether she wanted to attend a fireworks show, and she's rebuffed him. And the prosecution point to that particular date as being significant because it was just hours later that Sarah Spiers disappeared from Claremont, never to be seen again. Now I say that that's what the prosecution says because the witness today was really vague on when even that occasion was that her Mr. Edwards had asked her to the fireworks. She couldn't even pinpoint that it was on Australia Day. So that vagueness was no help really to the prosecutor because it didn't help them pinpoint at all this timeline. And if anyone should remember that date, you would have thought it would be her, although it is obviously many moons ago.
Well, that's it. I mean, the average person, because of what happened the next morning, the news, that Sarah had gone missing, most people or a lot of people can remember what they were doing. So it is interesting that the witness doesn't recall.
It was also, she sort of didn't recall quite a lot of significant sort of moments that she was being asked about. Like she said that like when she was being taken through signing the title of the house, like buying the house, like she would say, yes, that's my signature, but do you remember when this was? And she'd be like, no. Or when the house was sold, she's like, I don't remember specifically what date that was. And just really, me personally would have thought something like selling your house would be a date that you would remember, but she was saying she couldn't remember.
Yeah, divorce papers as well.
Yeah,
she couldn't remember signing those. She couldn't remember who witnessed those. She said, yes, that's my signature, but no, I don't remember. In an intimidating atmosphere in a courtroom, she knows the eyes of the state are on her. Maybe she was just being honest that she absolutely couldn't remember and didn't want to speculate.
One thing that she was quite clear was when she was being cross-examined with Paul Jovich, that when he asked her about that conversation and when he asked her about what the atmosphere was like when Mr. Edwards turned up at the house, she said it was very civil. The conversation was very civil. That they had dinner and that had dinner with her parents and that it was all fine. And then when he asked her about going, like when Mr. Edwards had asked her about going to the fireworks, and she said, oh yes, he asked, but I just didn't feel like going, that's why I said no. So her responses to that I thought was also quite interesting today, because obviously the prosecution are painting this picture that, she rebuffed him and he reacted in a way, but then on the stand she was very much, no, it was very civil, and like her saying no was just her saying no because she just didn't feel like going.
And Emily said before that, you were saying before that she was quite vague about when her own child was conceived as well. I mean, I think that would be something that you would remember. Yeah,
so that was another sort of question that she was being asked by the prosecution was if she could remember, as Tim was mentioning before, everything, all the questions being asked to pinpoint to certain periods of time. And one period of time that she was asking about was, there was just this one bit, because where I was sitting in the media room, we had this very close-up of Carmel Barbagallo, and so she was asking Mr. Edwards' first wife, when at what point does she remember conceiving the child? And she'd said earlier, I remember I found out I fell pregnant about April, May that year in 1996. And then she said, but can you remember when the baby was conceived? She said, I can't remember. And then she said, well, when was the baby born? And she said, December 21st, 1996. And she said, so, well, counting back. And then the woman said, well, she goes, I can't, she said, April or May. And then we were all looking at it, and then we could see Carmel roll her eyes sort of backwards, and it was just sort of everyone's just going, it's 9 months. Because the other thing that she kept asking was the baby full term? She said, yes, the baby was full term. So then she was kept saying, well, counting back. And then she just couldn't get to that. And obviously the way that the lawyers have to ask questions is they can't be leading questions. They have to be direct questions. So therefore to elicit a direct answer. And that's why she kept going back to this time period, and throughout that sort of throughout the whole sort of time on the stand with the prosecution, they kept trying to go back to this fireworks date and trying to get her to remember. She kept asking her, what was this, why were there fireworks on? She couldn't ask her, and she just couldn't say. She goes, I don't know, there were just fireworks, and she couldn't say what specific event this was for. But
so they were unable to establish at all that she was talking about the Australia Day fireworks.
Yeah.
Correct. And the importance of the timeline for the pregnancy is that the prosecution say that it was basically days after Mr. Edwards had been told by his wife that she was pregnant to another man, that he's gone out and committed the second murder. So once again, the timeline is very important for the motive, and getting the times right or trying to line them up is very important if the prosecution wants to try and press this motive. And once again, the vagueness about the date of the conception. I mean, obviously, there's no doubt about the date of the birth, and there's no doubt about that Mr. Edwards wasn't the father. So he was given that news at some point. But Mr. Jovich, in his question, then cast big doubt on that, because she had said that she remembered giving Mr. Edwards that news after she had moved in with the father of the baby at another house. Mr. Jovich was able to produce a document which showed that the gas at that house had not been switched on until the September. And he said, well, do you think you would be able to move into the house before the gas had been switched on? And she, I mean, it was a fair enough question with a probable answer. But if that was right, or that she was right, that news was given after she moved in, then that puts that date in September, which is way past when Miss Rimmer was murdered. So a little bit like yesterday, the cut, you're seeing a little bit of the cut and thrust and parry, and Mr. Jovich has been keeping this powder, immensely dry, and he's just being able to just have a little jab at some of these things finally. I mean, from my perspective, the couple of jabs that he's put out there have made some connection.
Yeah.
I mean, they can point to the dates, but I mean, nailing them down and proving them, I think from what we've seen today, might be a little bit trickier than they were anticipating.
And a second witness was called today. This was a friend of the couple?
Yeah, Karen McEnroy is her name. So she was a mutual friend of the couple that they met through, I guess, the first wife's interest in horses. The first wife had testified earlier that she'd bought a horse and kept it at a paddock in Wattle Grove, and met this couple who they basically socialised. And this woman said today that they socialised quite regularly, just about every weekend at this point in time in their lives. I think she sort of mentioned that there was like a few social occasions, and then this woman was then asked about had the first wife ever had she ever met the man who then came in between Mr. Edwards and his first wife, and how she met him and what she knew of him. And she said that basically he was kind of like the fifth wheel in this sort of couple group, because he basically was with them a lot of the time.
And I guess you must be sitting there when, this witness, for instance, and you're sitting there looking for where it is they're going with this. Where are they leading to? What's important about this? What's significant? But it's really just painting this picture of a very ordinary person.
Yeah, and it is. And it's if it was in front of a jury, perhaps it would be a little bit more. The questions would be a bit more pointed to try and make the point. But as we've said before, judge alone is a different legal beast, and they're trying to really tease out the nitty-gritty, the details, which then they will be able to present way into the future in the closing arguments. Well, the first wife said this, and Ms. McEnroy said this, and really connect all the dots, because as dramatic and as full of information as the openings were, that was just the picture on the jigsaw puzzle. And when it comes to the end, and you have to try and repaint the picture with all the details that have been heard, you need you need all the pieces to be in place to be able to present that picture, which is what they're trying to do.
And what are you both expecting in court tomorrow? Do you know who the next witnesses will be?
It'll be a continuation.
Well, we don't know for certain, but Mrs. McEnroy's husband was part of this friendship group, and he's been mentioned quite extensively. So logically, you would think it might be him, which is more details about the about the relationships and the back and forths of how they interacted over that time period. And then we keep rolling on. We have been told that next Monday, so Mr. Edwards' first wife, the man who got her pregnant, her lover at the time, he will be giving evidence on Monday. That's been locked in because he's giving evidence from overseas, and they have to book in a video link, and there was quite a significant time difference. So we know he's coming. And so, some of the personalities of that were in the lives of Mr. Edwards and his loved ones at the time will just be sort of slowly and painstakingly rolled out.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for your time today and for your time in court today. And tomorrow you'll both be back again. And Em, we can check your blogs on tomorrow.
On thewest.com.au.
West.com.au. And also, if you go onto that site, you'll be able to see never-before-seen images of Bradley Edwards, which has been released from today. So that's also on thewest.com.au. Thanks for listening, and we hope you can join us tomorrow for Day 4 of Claremont, the trial in conversation.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bonjolo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.